Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Exponential Europe podcast. My name is Jason Lim. I am part of the national team for Exponential in Germany, and I have the great honor of leading you through this journey of getting to know some of the faces of this community that is Exponential Europe, because that's what we are. We are a community with a cause. We want to see reproduction and multiplication become the norm in the behavior and language of the church in Europe. And so we're on this journey to meet some of these people, but also learn about the story behind Exponential and gain some insights into multiplication and reproduction. And today, I'm sitting here with a very honored guest.
I'm honored to be here.
I'm here with Raj
Pillai.
Pillai.
Yeah.
And you are what for the Exponential family?
So my title is Vice President, Chief of Staff. I work closely with Dave and oversee our staff in the strategy formulation, overarching plans, goals for the organization, working with our lead team.
So you've been part of Exponential US for how long now?
So I came on board January 15th of last year. So it's been a little over a year, and it's been a fantastic journey, so for about 15 months.
So before joining Exponential, tell us a little bit your journey. What are the most important facts and maybe milestones?
And you and I were just talking on the way to this room about growing up in different cultures and all that. So as you can tell, I was born and grew up in India.
Which part?
In Calcutta.
Oh, yeah.
And I actually grew up at a church that was planted by a missionary couple from Canada. So they left Winnipeg, Manitoba, and traveled all the way to Calcutta to plant a church. And they made a commitment of 1 year. But they ended up staying in India for 36 years.
Yeah.
And I'm a fruit of the ministry of church planters.
Wow.
And actually, that's one church, and as you know, in India is 2.3% Christian, Calcutta is like 0.6% Christian. And that one church that they founded in the city of Calcutta ended up planting 400 churches over 36 years, 400 churches all over East India. So I grew up in this context of church planting, sort of Exponential before Exponential was around.
You were part of Exponential India.
Yeah, I was part of Exponential India, part of God's exponential plan before we called it Exponential.
Right.
And so and got to see that. I grew up in the church from the time I was 3 years of age. So grew up in the church, and when I was 17, I interned at that church, and at 21, the Buntains, the missionary couple, invited me to join them on staff.
Wow.
I worked with youth ministry, communications, and radio ministry, and it was a blast. Did that for a few years. Then I came here for my higher studies at a college in Philadelphia in the mid-90s. Met my wife. She was from Maryland. We moved to Maryland. I did some consulting work for about 5 years with government agencies and stuff. Then the church we were attending invited me to come on board as a teaching and executive pastor, which I did for a number of years before they invited me to step into the lead pastor role. So I was the lead pastor of the church until 2023 and stepped down feeling like God was calling us to something else. And over the next 6 to 8 months, we prayed, we dreamed, we talked to a lot of friends, and then this opportunity at Exponential opened up, and I pursued it. God gave me favor. So I'm here. It kind of feels like I'm back in my own tribe.
Wow.
This is what I grew up in. This is the kind of environment I grew up in.
Was that put on pause for a little bit? Do you feel like you were out of that kind of world, or has that kind of stuck with you?
Yeah, Jason, like you talked about being in Germany and Thailand. So I feel like I was in different tribes for different seasons, and God had me there for a reason.
Right.
But this certainly feels like what I grew up.
Right.
The kind of environment I grew up in. Very entrepreneurial, very apostolic.
Yeah.
Breaking up new ground.
Yeah.
Dreaming of impacting a world through seeing millions of lives being saved and changed and transformed. So, yeah.
Millions of questions coming into my brain. I'm going to try to order them.
Yeah. Start with the easy ones.
Let's go back, because I'm curious. You've grown up in the context of a church, which is similar to Oyvind. He's grown up. He came to faith in in a multiplying church.
Right.
To him, it's almost like
Yeah.
that was the
It's like
norm.
second
That was the
nature.
norm, right?
Yeah.
And then realizing, oh, it's not the norm in other places. So you grew up in this context in India in a church that was sending out church planters. What did that look like, and how did you experience that?
Yeah.
Was that quite organic? Did they just,
Yeah.
you were used to every second Sunday you're saying goodbye to people? You're like, oh yeah, or what did that?
That's a great question, Jason. It's like you're making me travel down memory lane.
Hopefully not triggering
Yeah.
trauma or something.
But number of thoughts. One is I love cultural anthropology. I studied that in college, and I have a huge passion for cultures around the world. And you often hear culture being described as the software on which the hardware of your brain runs, right? So when you grow up in that kind of a software, you kind of think that's the norm,
Yeah.
right?
You don't
So
think
because
about
that's
Yeah.
all you've known.
That's
You
the
know,
water
that's the kind of church.
That's the water you're swimming in.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Rivers of thinking. So I to go back to your question, I think a lot of it was organic. It wasn't. I think when Mark and Hulda Buntain went to India, they weren't thinking we're going to be planting hundreds of churches.
Right.
They wanted to start this one church and then leave, but they became drawn into community. I was one of the Buntain boys. It's like they were like family. So and really with them, they worked very closely with Mother Teresa. I got to meet Mother Teresa multiple times. She in fact prayed for me one time. So just the joy and privilege of that. So I think as the church grew, they kind of came to a point where like, do we keep building bigger buildings? And how many people do we, especially given the traffic in India, how many people are going to be coming? Even if it's short distance.
How much congestion are we going to cause?
Exactly,
in the city?
exactly. So, and that church, that mother church, grew to be about 2,000.
Wow.
Before they started to plant, they planted a church in North Calcutta, then South Calcutta, then other parts of Calcutta, then other parts of Bengal, then other parts of Northeast India,
and did that come? Were there people that approached the leadership and said, I want to go? Was it the leadership that said, we need to send people? Like, how did that kind of happen?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
So there was a group of people that were finding Christ from like a location in North Calcutta. So they were like, okay, you guys, you're a church. Let's start a community there. And then you would ordain and designate somebody to go.
Wow.
The Buntins, also realized there was some theological training needed. So they actually started a little training institute, which became a Bible college, which still exists. It's fully accredited. It's training pastors and
in Calcutta.
And
as you mentioned that city, I thought that I might have a friend who actually went to that Bible college.
Oh, really? West Bengal Bible College.
Maybe, but
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So, so a lot of it was organic. And what's interesting is the mother church not only sent people but also resourced them. So, and this will be fun for you to hear is that, and this is a context I grew up in. We were taught to give 3 offerings every week.
Yes.
Yeah. There was the tithes
Yes.
offering. Then there was a thanks offering, and then there was faith promise. So tithing was the base.
Right.
10% was the base.
Yeah.
That's where you started.
Yeah. Listen,
and
Western.
and you're talking about a community.
Christianity.
Yeah. You're talking about community in India that isn't super rich.
Yeah.
A lot of people are impoverished. So you start with the 10%, and then every year you make a faith promise. God, with your help, I want to give more to the kingdom. So people could, you can go like 1%, 2%, whatever more, and then every church service would end with a thanks offering. It's like if God has answered a prayer, if God has resourced you, give it back to the invest back in the kingdom. And there would be like a treasure chest in front of the church, in front of the stage. And so
people walk up front and
just
give thanks to the Lord.
Yeah. So as the last song is being sung, as people are exiting, a whole bunch of people go in the front and drop thanks offering. All of that thanks offering would go towards funding church planting.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
What fascinates me about your story is you've experienced it as a member of a church.
Yeah.
Multiplication.
Yeah.
You've experienced multiplication as someone who's been invested in yourself. You've experienced multiplication, but you also looked at it now from a church leadership perspective yourself as you became a lead pastor. So when you now are in a position where you're leading a church, how much are you drawing from those experiences, and how much are you realizing maybe different contexts, or
Yeah.
also the difficulty of, if it's not been ingrained in the DNA of a church yet,
Yeah.
bringing that in is not, if it was as easy as putting a treasure box in the front of the service and being like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but I don't know how your experience was leading a church and bringing multiplication into
Yeah.
that somehow.
So when I was a pastor at the church in Maryland. Two things, to give a little context. Growth by addition is what most pastors know. And Bill Kokenauer, who is our director of deployment, he would be a great person to have on your podcast. This guy is a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. He could be a professor somewhere, really. But he has written an article that's on Exponential website, and he talks about this angst that senior pastors often feel. It's like, you're growing your church, but am I making disciples? Am I just building a bigger building? Bodies, building, budget. These are three things that a lot of American pastors kind of gauge their success with. So I kind of got in that track a little bit too, in that mode of thinking.
Right.
I kind of lost a little bit of what I grew up in.
Yeah.
But where it got ignited in me again was I now was in a place of influence and had the ability to direct resources where I was able to invest in church plants overseas, through missions. So that kind of got me back into the field a little bit. And then my last few years that I was, leading the church, part of our strategic plan was to plant a church, So we raised the funds for that, and we got things in place,
But that's what fascinates me about your story, because you looked at multiplication from so many different angles.
Yeah.
Both as a 3-year-old, if you will, right?
Yeah.
But then as a youth leader, then you go abroad and you've experienced investment. You're now a lead pastor, and you're figuring out, how do I bring this back into it? And then you become part of Exponential, and you're looking at it from even a different angle.
Yeah.
Not just one church, but like a bunch of churches across the country. What do you see as a continuously as kind of the most common obstacles that people either internally or intrinsically or extrinsically are faced with when it comes to the mindset of multiplication?
So two thoughts. One is that we often say here at Exponential that you can build your castle, you can build your church, or you can build the kingdom. You can be part of the kingdom movement that's bigger than your church. Kingdom over castle is what we often say. So I think part of it is the Western mindset we can create measures of success that's around, how is my church doing? Is it growing? Are there more people? Is it bigger building? Is it bigger budget? Is it having a bigger impact? Is it having a bigger footprint? Versus, how is the church doing? How is my church doing versus how is the church doing? And how is my work establishing God's kingdom beyond just my little church? So that's one thing. I think that's one obstacle. The second thing is, I think the pandemic caused us all to rethink how we do church, as I said earlier. So are we really making disciples? Or are we creating Sunday attenders? And a good friend of mine, Leon Crump, who pastors a church in Atlanta, he's written a book about resilience for pastors and different shifts that have happened. And one of the things he writes about in his book is how people used to measure regular attendance by folks coming to church every Sunday. Now it's every four weeks. For some people, it's every 6 weeks. So the dynamics have changed. And so what does disciple making mean in this context?
So a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
Have they changed how often they measure attendance because the numbers are just depressing and they don't want to be exposed to those numbers? Or because they realize maybe those are not the numbers we need to be looking
at? So the pollsters, there's all kinds of polls, right? So the pollsters used to ask, do you regularly attend church? And by regularly attend church, they meant almost every Sunday,
Right.
every week. And that definition has changed.
And so
The definition of regular attendance
right,
has changed. So now when they're
right.
asking people, people say, yeah, I attend regularly. But
Meaning,
in person, I'm there once a month or twice a month at
right,
most. But I'm watching online.
right.
And the
So
church,
again, the question of like, of all the things we've invested before the pandemic,
yeah,
do we see in the pandemic the fruits of that, or do we can then see, oh wow, it's not had that big of an effect on people if,
right.
yeah,
Last year, our theme was 180, return to disciple making. And when we started the first session, Dave Ferguson got up, and the first thing he said, the first statement he said, we have not done a good job making disciples. I think we're all feeling a sense of that.
yeah,
I'll give you a personal example. So I told you about this church I led in Maryland.
yeah,
So the pandemic hit, and we saw, like every other church,
right,
a whole bunch of people started watching online, and we eventually we encouraged people to do more in-person attendance. So I was in the grocery store one day, just pushing my cart down the aisle, and this couple comes along on the other side. I recognize them as members of my church, right? So I'm like, hey, how are you? I'm like, I haven't seen you guys in a long time. It's been like a while. And they said, oh, Pastor, uh, since the pandemic, we have not gone back. We just love the option of watching services online.
right,
Now, I didn't know them very well, but I knew them well enough to know that I hadn't seen them in a while, and I knew they were part of my church. So I said, so you have not come once since the pandemic. This is 2 years after the
oh,
pandemic.
2 years.
For 2 years,
Oh,
they
yeah.
had just engaged online and had never stepped foot on our premises. It was shocking to me. And they're smiling. They're like, we love the sermons. We just enjoy the service so much. We love the worship. We
Right,
love what the church is doing. We love what you're doing. We love your messages.
right,
And I'm just standing there like in a state of kind of shock.
right,
How can somebody say I'm fully now? Of course, not that you can't be. I mean, I know there's all kinds of digital church movements that have started. Mark Lutz, a good friend of mine, he's engaging so many people in the digital world and drawing them towards Christ. But it kind of hit me. So I'm like, so do you have any other relationships? Are you in a small group, in a class? And they're like, no, we just love getting up on Sunday morning, making a cup of coffee, and we are in our pajamas and just kind of roll our bed, under the sofa, and we just love it.
right.
So I think it's this whole idea of Jesus saying, deny yourself
Mm.
versus what's comfortable.
The comfort and the consumerism.
Yeah, yeah,
Going back to what you said with the castle and the kingdom
yeah.
and the cultural nuance of that, do you think in individualistic cultures where it's, how am I doing? Does that then translate to, how's my church doing? And you're more kind of, you're less concerned about the community. And so, like, how are we as the church doing? Is that easier, for example, in the Indian context, as a collective culture where you think more about us as Christians in the nations rather than just like us
Yeah.
in our church, or do you see no difference there?
I think that's a great thought, Jason. When I look at the Indian church, a lot of Indian churches are small.
Mm.
And they're small and they spawn off other churches. Right?
Right.
They plant other churches, they start cell churches, they start home fellowships. And part of it is just the context of the climate. There's hostility, there's persecution, and all those kind of things. But part of it is this whole idea of that those churches are communally based to
Right.
begin with. But I will say this, as you were asking me this question, the thought that went through my mind is another thing the pandemic exposed is how lonely people are.
Yeah.
Mental health issues just went up 4 times. I did a whole sermon series on mental health. That was one of our most downloaded series, in our history. We created a whole mental resource guidebook and health and where to ask for help, and we had tons of people use it. Some research says that mental health, anxiety, and panic attacks and depression went up 4 times.
Wow.
Normal
Right.
from pre-pandemic levels in America.
Yeah.
So, and I know of counselors, Christian counselors that are friends of mine that have said they just don't have any time. They are like booked solid.
Yeah.
They are not taking any new people.
Yeah.
You know? So, which is a good thing that it exposed this missing piece in our lives.
Right.
But the church has something to say about that.
Right.
You know, at Exponential this year, we featured the story of Molly Soderstrom. You know, she founded this movement in Denver called The Brook. And it's all around engaging people digitally and bringing them to places, public places where they can just experience community and then drawing them into talking about spiritual truths, you know. And so first addressing the issue of loneliness and friendship, and then bringing them into a place where they can talk about God and Jesus and the Bible.
Because people long for community.
Yeah.
Even though, you know, the virtual thing might be attractive.
Right.
At the end of the day, where's a community of people that are, you know, that can respond to the immediate situation of my life.
Right.
And can listen, and it's not just a one-way street of, you know, I'm being preached to, but also like
right.
I'm being invited into a conversation.
Yeah. Now, I will say the flip side of it is, you know, I also know of families in my church context that I was at that had health issues and because we upped the game in streaming, and you know, so they were so grateful. They're
Right.
like,
Obviously.
we can't physically come,
Yeah.
but we're so grateful that
Yeah.
the experience is like as if we are there.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So there's kind of nuance to all this.
Of course.
Yeah.
When you think about Exponential, in your role now, kind of what are your hopes for the next, let's say, 10 years of where this goes?
So I've been on Exponential, part of the Exponential lead team now for a year, and it's I love our team. I love serving with them. But the vision God has given us, you know, Dave's leadership brings so much clarity around our vision, the 16% mission. And how are we going to get there? So we are going to be, you know, we have created a strategic plan around it, and increasingly we feel pulled to the global church. How can we serve and also learn from the global church? So I think in terms of where we are and what we're looking at, there's a lot of whiteboard moments that's going to happen in the next few weeks and months. But I think God is doing something around this whole idea of disciples making disciples that plant churches. And my hope is that this sparks a movement. And you know, at Exponential, we are very clear about we are not the ones planting churches. We are helping church planters. You know, you can do it, we can help. So we come alongside churches, we come alongside networks and denominations and resource them and cheer them on, and you know, come be part of the community with a cause where we can all do this together. And that's a great strength of Exponential, because it can draw people from so many different backgrounds. It's not just one church doing it, one network, one denomination. It's all of us. We are kind of united around this mission. So I hope that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see thousands, maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of new churches that are being planted, that are reaching millions of people for Christ.
Amen.
Yeah.
So the 16% mission, for those that don't know,
yeah,
can you briefly explain that?
Yeah. So Exponential has done a lot of research, and what we find is that there's about 350,000 churches in America. And if you look at these churches, we have what we call 5 levels of churches. Level 1 churches are churches that are declining. They're probably going to close down if nothing radical happens. Level 2 churches are churches that have flatlined. Almost 80% of churches in America are level 1 or level 2. Level 3 churches are churches that are growing. 13% of churches that are level 3. Level 4 churches are churches that are planting churches. And level 5 churches are churches that are planting churches that are planting churches. Only 7% of churches are level 4, level 5. And Exponential's vision and goal is that we want to see 16% of churches in America become level 4, level 5. And part of it is around this whole idea of the tipping point.
Right.
And, you know, if 16% of the population adopts something, it starts to become a movement.
Right.
You know?
And what are kind of main ways to push that forward? What do you think are vital if other countries are not thinking about it? Like, oh, I wonder where we are and how do we get to 16%? what can we learn from how you've kind of tried to push that
Yeah.
the needle towards that?
Oh man, this could be a very long answer, but you can find all the information at exponential.org. um, what I would say is we have actually, if you go to exponential.org, you'll find our ministry model. I think that it would take me a long time to explain that. We have four different ways that people can get engaged, and the first way is the pioneer, the new, fresh expressions of churches. We call it Exponential Next. What's coming around the corner? And people get curious about that. Like as leaders, we want to know what's coming.
Yeah.
Right? So we look at the latest trends, the latest research. We spend a lot of money in doing research, highlighting churches that are doing innovative stuff. That's one. The second piece is what we call our party block, party vertical, where we do conferences, where we want people to come and learn and grow. Really, the key word there is inspire. Get inspired to do around this vision. And then the third vertical is what we call paradigm, which is where we go deeper into the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of why this is important and how. And that I would say, if you want to use one word, Dave often uses the word think. We want to make people think about this. And then the last vertical is practice. Now that we've gone through all this, how do we put this into practice? And the key word there is action. So, you want to make people curious, you want to inspire them, you want to make them think, and then you want them to take action. So again, all of this is on exponential.org.
That's really cool. So you started more with the inspire piece, right? I mean, the history of Exponential US was a denominational conference for church planters, I think. And
there was a few pastors coming together and saying, the way we do church is not working.
And then you open it up.
Yeah.
And suddenly thousands come, and you're like, oh, this is a real conversation.
Yeah. Right.
And then we need to start, and then obviously Exponential builds out of that. When did the pioneering, like the kind of the research, when did that come? Was that there from the beginning?
I think it was more gradual.
Yeah.
And as we started to have other things come around, we're like, the ministry model, the way it is right now, is something that developed over 20 years.
Right.
And we have, I would say, close to 12, 15 frameworks, and Dave's written books about this, and he's writing a book that'll be the theme book for next year called Multiplier.
Right.
That's going to talk about some of these frameworks. The Hero Maker framework, the 5 levels of churches framework, the ministry model framework. So we have all these different frameworks. So it's years and years of research and study and learning from what's happening in the field, and just kind of refining what we had.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you go global from there,
do
you then anticipate, some of those frameworks being different in different contexts and cultural situations?
I think there's going to be some things that's going to remain the same.
Yeah.
The vision around disciples making disciples that plant churches, and I think that's going to be the unifying thing. But I think there's going to be other things that will have to be contextualized.
Yeah. Have you seen examples of that already when you think about some of the global friends you have?
Exponential Europe has the M4.
Yeah.
System. I think Exponential Australia has some other tools that they've created. Espanol has some other things that they're learning, that Hispanic churches have a way of doing things. So how do we contextualize it in their context? Again, they're all unified around this idea that God is calling us to plant churches, and that's the most effective way to expand God's kingdom and disciple people. But the context in which it's being done and the way it's being done, that could be different.
Yeah. Which again, going back to what you were mentioning about Exponential Europe, just to clarify for the listeners, M4 is one of our partners of creating a church planting process for the first 2 years.
Right.
And then looking at, how those processes maybe differ also with our different partners across Europe in different contexts.
Right.
Because I think that's the difficulty with Europe, right? It's a continent.
Yeah.
The linguistic, cultural barriers, even the spiritual situation of Catholic, Orthodox, secular, all those mixed together.
Sounds a lot like India.
Yeah, and then the different cultures come in together, the different belief systems.
Yeah.
Also, there's different church histories within each of those countries so the existing paradigms. But now also, I think a big piece for us, and this is, I think, similar to what you were saying with Exponential US thinking, we've got to think globally. the reality of the majority of Christians within our countries, oftentimes, especially for Germany, are the non-German speaking churches. Those are the those are the majority churches, right?
Yeah.
And so because they're from the majority of the Christian world is no longer, the global north, but the global south.
The church I was at, we partnered with a church in Germany, Aurich, I think the city of Aurich near Frankfurt. It's a small town.
Okay, I don't know.
And Aurich.
Aurich.
Yeah.
Aurich.
So we had the pastor come over one time, and right in the height of all these refugees that were streaming into Germany.
Right.
And he said, so I remember having lunch with him. I asked him, I said, so it's something you said triggered this thought, this conversation in my mind. I asked him, so what is it like? Are you guys like struggling, overwhelmed? And he said, oh, this is a massive opportunity for the kingdom.
Yeah.
Just the mindset, and he just started smiling. He said, our church is fully engaged.
Yeah.
We want to reach these people with Jesus.
Yeah.
We would not have been able to go into their countries and preach the gospel to them, but now they're in our country.
Totally. So, like from a missional perspective, like that's been hugely encouraging.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have big Chinese churches, big South Korean churches, big African churches, and a lot of our thinking within Europe have not included those churches, right? And so you have to think about like if we continue moving forward, what about the majority of Christians in Germany, which are non-Germans probably?
Right.
How do we bring them into this conversation?
It is,
and that adds another layer of complexity of like, where are the African churches and the Asian churches in our gatherings, and how do they get a voice? And then you have colonial history, which complicates some of those situations because there's a narrative in that challenges those encounters from numerous angles. But I think that's really something where looking at what Exponential US has done with Exponential Espanol and giving room and space to the migrant and diaspora churches to come in, I think is something also we can really learn from Exponential US and how we do that better. Because that's going to, but it's already complicated enough, Europe. Now we're making it even more complicated with that variable.
There's challenges, always challenges, but within those challenges are opportunities.
Absolutely.
Years ago, I was at the Wesleyan Chapel in London, where John Wesley preached, and it's like a historic site, right? Methodism was born there and all that. And I started talking to the docent who was there, who was taking us around, my wife and me. And I said, so I had heard that the church had kind of dwindled down to just a few people. I said, how are you guys doing now? She said, oh, it's busting at the seams. It's standing room only on Sundays. I'm like, really? That's amazing. She said, yeah, new type of revival is going on. But most of the church is made up of immigrants.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And then how do we leverage that and pivot that back into reaching,
reaching everyone.
And so that's, I think, one of the challenges we see going forward. Raj, when you think about a church planter, or a church struggling to multiply or is new to this whole idea, and you had an opportunity to sit them down and speak comforting and encouraging words to them, what would you say to someone who's like, I don't know, I can plant a church, I don't know, like multiplication, it seems so big, I hear these stories, but mostly it's from these grand churches that are, multiplying, like, not sure I can do that. What are some words of encouragement for us in Europe?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I recently, last year, had a conversation with a couple that was getting ready to plant a church. And my biggest encouragement is, you're in the forefront of the kingdom of God. What you're doing is having a massive impact in a way that you can't even see it. It's unseen realms, right? We are functioning in a way that's bigger than the reality we see. But one of the key pieces of advice that I would give, and again, I haven't planted a church, but I have been part of a church, and I was part of a church planting church when I grew up. And so seeing all that, I think, would be to build friendships with established churches. So I said that to this couple, and they connected with a friend of mine who has a large church, and this church actually had them speak. And then on the spur of the moment, Spirit moved, and they said, "Some of you here are being called to go with this couple."
Wow.
And so this friend of mine asked people to stand, and a whole bunch of people stood up, and they're like, "You guys go take your tithes to this church." Now that's a bold move, and that, so I called him. I said, "Man, well done." I told my friend, I said, "You exemplified what it means to be about the kingdom over castle." So if more, instead of saying, how do I kind of keep my sheep and keep my tithes and offering, we need to get that kingdom mindset. We need to come around these church planters that are in the forefront.
But also, I like what you said. I think the struggle sometimes with church planters is they're so, focused, maybe even tensed up, trying to get this thing done. They forget that, it wasn't meant to be a lonely road of them just doing it by themselves. Like, gather friends around you.
Exactly. You need people around.
Because sometimes it can be this kind of mentality of, oh, they don't understand. They're not church planters.
Right.
But you need friends. And a wonderful example of who knows if you bring an established church into this. And we've experienced this in Frankfurt as well, where, the planting a daughter church within the neighborhood where there's already an existing church. The district is big enough for way more churches than just two. And the pastor of that church, because there was a friendship there, he's like, "Oh, that's wonderful." And he started reaching out to people like, of apartments in our neighborhood where these church planters could move into. They told the church planter, "If you ever need like an office space, you can come to our church office and work here." And then like just the invitation, and it just creates a very different experience, because you're like, "Oh, I'm not by myself. There's someone I can go to." You need friends.
Yeah.
And even in multiplication, I like stories that we have in Frankfurt of where it's not one church that's multiplied. It's like a bunch of different churches have said, one church might have taken the initiative that we're going to plant a church here. Another church, "Oh, that's great. We'll send some people too." Like, it becomes a collaborative multiplication of like, let's gather around these church planters together and make it a kind of communal piece. Because again, it goes back to what you were saying, right? The mentality of kingdom and not castle. The mentality of are we looking to Jesus and his kingdom and what he wants to do, or are we just looking to our little castle we've built for ourselves?
That leads me to another great phrase I've learned at Exponential and from Dave, is to be a friends on mission.
Yeah.
I love that. Love that. Friends on mission. John 15, Jesus says, "I've called you my friends."
Yeah.
Not servants.
Yeah.
I call you my friends.
Well, friend, thank you for taking the time.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
So many good thoughts, and I'm sure it's really insightful and helpful, and it's good to be part of a global family.
Amen to that.
Thanks.
Thank you, my brother.